Good morning. Good morning. See, this is the problem. I used to sit right over there, so I know what it's like to be at mandatory chapel. And a lot of memories are coming flooding back to me as I stand in front of you. Before I get to that, I want to tell you that it really is remarkable to be with you today as you as a campus are grieving the loss of a friend, and I want you to know that my heart is with you on that. As I thought about putting this speech together, I thought about what it was like to sit over there and to listen to speakers come day after day. And, I'll be perfectly honest with you. As I sat in that seat, typically I was more focused generally on the boys who were around me than the speakers who were in front of me. None of you, I know, are right there with me. Maybe some of the rest of you are worrying about a test later today or homework that you need to finish surreptitiously while I speak. So, it's okay. It's all right. I'm going to work hard to distract you. So let's start this morning with a question. This is my subversive intent. So let's start with a question, and you all have to respond. How many of you have been on a real date in the last month? I need hands. A real one. Yeah, all right. The thing I want you to think about today is that dating in our culture today is a subversive act. Dating is a subversive act. So now you're saying, isn't this talk supposed to be about abortion and public policy? Dr. Amstutz in particular is a little worried about where I'm going with all this. So indeed it is. But I'm hoping today to challenge you to see the politics of abortion in a very different way than you usually do. If you're doing your homework, take a break and tweet at me to ask me questions, tell me whether or not you disagree or agree with me. Because the truth of the matter is, I'm really used to speaking to much more hostile audiences than you all, so I can pretty much take whatever you want to throw at me. So what I'd like to do, if this were a smaller group, I'd like to go around and hear from you what you think I'm going to say about abortion today, because I'm guessing in this audience that you have a pretty good idea of what you think I'm going to say. You think I'm going to argue that life is a beautiful choice, that each human life is unique and wonderfully created and worthy of defending. And it certainly is. I'm very proud to stand before you today as head of an organization that was involved with legislation that just passed recently in North Dakota. It was the first of its kind ever in the country that bans abortion for sex selection or genetic abnormalities. First in the nation. I'm very proud of that bill, and I'm very appalled that we even need to have that kind of legislation. I was on NPR this week defending that legislation, and a caller called in and she said, are you really ready to deal with the fallout of that legislation? The fallout of that legislation. What does she mean by the fallout? She means a living, breathing human being who had the misfortune of being born not perfect. That's fallout. I could talk about that. I could talk about the poster that hangs in my office of Wheaton the elephant that says, "A person's a person, no matter how small." I could talk about that today, but I'm not going to. I started with the question of dating, and you're all wondering, what in the world was that all about? Because I want to steal a line from the radical feminists of the 60s and 70s and convince you today that the personal is political. The feminists of the tumultuous 70s argued that the personal is political, and what they meant by that is that women as individuals, as people, personally, in their personal lives, live desperate lives of patriarchal oppression. I wanted to be sure you guys didn't feel left out. And that... You're welcome. And that the only redress was through collective action, politicizing their personal grievances. A well-known essay from those times by Carol Hanisch from 1969 defined the phrase "the personal is political," and she said, "I've been forced to take off the rose-colored glasses and face the awful truth about how grim my life really is as a woman." So you all are pretty familiar with the 60s and 70s, I'm sure. Haven't you ever kind of wondered, like, where did this sense of oppression come from? What was that all about? What I want you to think about, this is the pivotal point, is that that sense of oppression was rooted in difference between men and women. And it really fundamentally shows itself in motherhood, in the sexual difference between men and women, in the immutable fact that becoming a mother is a far different experience for a woman than becoming a father is for a man. And so too is the sexual experience different for men and women. So follow me closely here, follow me closely. In order for women to compete on an even playing field with men, there is a difference rooted in unequal consequences from sexual intimacy. Let's state the obvious: women get pregnant and men do not. In order for women to compete on a completely even playing field, that difference had to be then, and still today has to be, erased or neutralized. Women had to be able to walk away, just like men. And that's the nexus. It's at this nexus, at that very, very fine point in the debate, that abortion sits very uneasily in our culture today. In a horribly obscene and twisted way, abortion became the foundation of female empowerment in our culture. And in some narratives, it's even the route to self-actualization. Now, one reason that it's sort of fun for me to get to address you today is that my oldest daughter is a sophomore at another university. And she tells me there's a popular graffiti wall on her campus, which, sad to say, is very different than this one. Across the top it says, "Before I graduate, I want to." It's big black chalkboard, and students scribble their answers in chalk. One person wants to travel to the moon, another wants to sing in the amphitheater, and another one, who's a person after my own heart, simply wants to sleep. But then another person wrote that before graduating, they wanted to end abortion. But another person came along and struck through that with their chalk. Underneath, they scrawled, "Have an abortion, have an abortion." And then they put a check mark that they had checked that aspiration off their list. Done, accomplished. Here is the central premise of today's feminism. In its guise as reproductive freedom, abortion becomes the irreducible minimum of feminine empowerment. A leader of the third wave of feminism, some of you may be familiar with Rebecca Walker, the daughter of Alice Walker, who is the author of The Color Purple, wrote an essay in Harper's back in her 20s, actually, and she was addressing her comments to young women, and she outlined this feminist conception of reproductive rights as power. I'm going to read a slightly long quote from her because it's important. She wrote, "I hope that the speech I'm going to give you will encourage you to see that your abortion can be a rebellious and empowering act. It is an act through which you can assert yourself, one which can enable you to feel more connected to women around the world. It is a surgical operation with a mission. My hope is that after your abortion, you will commit some part of your life to making sure that others are able to claim their own rights. And by doing this, you will use your abortion to connect to women everywhere. You will connect your very special person with the very important political, and you will begin to know your own power." You see, the rationale for abortion rights has very subtly, but very significantly shifted over time. For decades, the postmodernist feminist movement pursued brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and very disciplined messaging. They closed their agenda as being about equal rights for women, and they've consistently framed their debate using appealing, unassailable, and all-American rhetoric of choice and privacy. However, in the early 90s, they very subtly and very effectively began deploying a subtext, carefully marketing a new theme that is now woven into the American subconscious. And that's why I want to underscore this for you today, because I want you to start watching for these messages in marketing around you. It's unrecognized by most people, but in your everyday life, you see this message all the time, that abortion rights is now part of the quest for feminine empowerment. President Obama is actually one of the best articulators of this message. Let me give you a quote from his first campaign for president, where he was articulating why he supported choice. He said, "A woman's ability to decide how many children to have and when without interference from the government is one of the most fundamental rights we possess. It is not just an issue of choice, but equality and opportunity for all women." Equality and opportunity for all women. So the key point here, however, is that while this worldview is being deployed on multiple fronts through marketing and through speeches and even in selling products, there's really far more to it than merely marketing. Americans United for Life is the legal architect of the pro-life movement. What we focus on is the constitutional framework of the abortion right. And what I want you to learn today is that the messaging on women in power has moved in concert with the underlying legal strategy defending abortion rights. The legal rationale for reproductive freedom has also evolved very significantly. One of the most important decisions was in 1992 with Casey v. Planned Parenthood, and in that decision, Justice Kennedy, and I know you all understand the significance of Justice Kennedy as the swing vote on the Supreme Court on abortion, he wrote in Casey v. Planned Parenthood why, in his mind, we still need abortion at that time. And here's what he wrote in writing for the majority in Casey. "For 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives." This notion that women must have abortion in order to be powerful permeates feminist thought. In fact, AUL has a counterpart on the abortion side of things. The legal arm of the feminist movement is called the Center for Reproductive Rights, and on their website, they explicitly make this connection. Listen with me. Reproductive rights, the foundation for women's self-determination over their bodies and sexual lives, are critical to women's equality and to ensuring global progress toward just and democratic societies. This connection between reproductive rights and democracy illustrates just how foundational this idea has become, woven into the public policy of our country and into our constitutional jurisprudence. For example, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in dissenting from the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the ban on partial birth abortion in Gonzales v. Carhart, let that soak in for a minute. She's dissenting from upholding the ban on partial birth abortion. So she's saying that she thinks that we should not have a ban on partial birth abortion. And she says that women cannot enjoy equal citizenship stature without abortion on demand. So abortion is an essential precursor to citizenship in our country? The entire feminist ideological edifice now rests on the right to abortion in a way that is very little recognized by the pro-life movement and even less acknowledged explicitly and publicly by the feminist movement themselves. Now, I told you a little bit earlier about Rebecca Walker. I actually had an opportunity to meet her and to debate her. I was invited to debate Gloria Steinem when I was pregnant with our first daughter, Hannah. And while that was actually interesting, it was much more interesting to meet Rebecca because she had just graduated from Yale University. This was 20 years ago now. And she and I got to talking. She was particularly interested for some reason, I think partly because I was pregnant. And I started talking to her about abortion and the fact that the reason I'm pro-life is because I believe that's the pro-woman position. She looked at me absolutely dumbfounded and said, a graduate of Yale University, she said, "I have never heard of such a thing." She said to me in high offense, "You cannot be pro-life and pro-woman." So this is the central premise of today's feminism. I don't get to be a legitimate woman because I'm pro-life. which that's actually should be a laugh line. It amuses me to no end that I'm not legit. But a funny thing happened. A funny thing happened on the way to empowerment. Grief. Grief happened. Abortion actually harms the very women that it claims to be empowering. And this, frankly, is posing a very, very difficult challenge for the culture of death. Another interview that I was invited to participate in a debate on CNN with a woman who had launched a greeting card company that specialized in sympathy cards after abortion. And so the whole line of cards, none of them actually mentioned abortion, but it was all about sympathy for their loss. And my argument to her was, if you're not willing to admit that what the substance of that loss was, you can't really address that grief. You can't get at it. Well, going back as far as 1995, Naomi Wolf, who's another feminist author I imagine you're familiar with, recognized that this was a problem for the pro-abortion movement. And she wrote, shockingly candid, particularly for 1995, she said, "We need to contextualize the fight to defend abortion rights within a moral framework that admits that the death of a fetus is a real death." Picking up on this, she, by the way, set off a complete firestorm among feminists who were absolutely livid with her that she was willing to put those words in writing. But slowly but surely, feminist writers, particularly the more honest ones, are trying to grapple with this intellectual contradiction that they can't square the circle of. Jennifer Baumgardner, who's an activist and the author of Abortion and Life, in this book, Abortion and Life, asks a really, really probing question, which, ironically, she never answers in the entire book. She says, what do you do if a patient wants to baptize the remains? I guess remains, fallout. I have to come up with different euphemisms for the baby. So what we're seeing as they're trying to grapple with grief is that there's a shift in symbolism from coat hangers to angel's wings. One website has a headline that says, "Find your own spirit image to help heal the abortion experience. Put an angel or a fairy on your personal altar or sacred space and use it to remind you of the sad but sometimes necessary sacrifice of abortion." Justice Kennedy said that the effect of relying on Roe for a place in society cannot be exactly measured, and he fears the certain cost of overruling Roe. But they are ignoring the certain cost of the endurance of the culture of death. Emma Beck was a young British woman who was pregnant with twins. And under pressure from her boyfriend, who did not want the baby, she aborted both of them. Months later, she plunged into a deep depression that she was not able to pull herself out of, and she hanged herself. She left behind a note that said, "Living is hell for me. I should never have had an abortion. I was frightened, and now it's too late. I died when my babies died." At the inquest, the coroner concluded it is clear that the termination of pregnancy can have a profound effect on a woman's life. Ladies and gentlemen, the medical establishment is doing their best to sit on the data about post-abortion syndrome, but the data is very, very clear that there is an increased risk of suicide following an abortion. So what does this empowerment that we've inherited from the feminist movement look like? In January, Planned Parenthood held a press conference before the 40th anniversary of Roe and said that they weren't going to talk about choice anymore. They weren't going to talk about choice. It was not working for them anymore, for a lot of the reasons I've sketched out. So what are they going to talk about? They said they're going to start talking about how complicated abortion is, And they are nothing if not disciplined on their side of the ledger. About a week later in Salon, an article appeared, and I'm wondering how many of you all saw this. Mary Beth Williams wrote an article that was breezily entitled, "So What If Abortion Ends a Life?" Anybody see it? It made quite a firestorm on the internet because once again we find somebody who's being candid, and she said, here's the complicated, see, watch for these words, they're disciplined in their messaging. Here's the complicated reality in which we live. All life is not equal. That's a difficult thing for liberals like me to talk about, lest we wind up looking like death panel loving, kill your grandma and your precious baby stormtroopers. That's her, not me. So, what's a girl to do, or an abortion lobby, as the case may be with all this complication? Just like Jennifer Baumgardner, Williams never really does find a way to answer or even finesse the question. In the end, she just very callously admits that it all comes down to brute power. Here's what she said: "Yet a fetus can be a human life without having the same rights as the woman in whose body it resides. She's the boss. Her life and what is right for her circumstances and her health should automatically trump the rights of the non-autonomous entity inside of her, always." Throughout history, whenever those in power have wanted to assert their dominance and pursue a culture of death, they begin by defining their victims as outside the community of caring, beyond human compassion. They ostracize them as the other, over there, beyond community. A person becomes subhuman or an inferior race, a blob of tissue morally equivalent to a tonsil, or a non-autonomous entity. So in working to defend the defenseless to establish justice, we stand in a historic tradition of William Wilberforce, Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman. We stand in the historic tradition of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and the Civil Rights Movement. This is the great human rights struggle of our day. We are fighting for human rights for human beings. Here's the thing: without a deep reverence for common humanity, the quest for power becomes a chasing after the wind. And in that vacuum, in the place of nothingness, they've inserted this twisted veneration of abortion. They've rooted women's power not in creating life, but in its destruction. So this is the central move that I want you to track with me on today, that I want you to see. Why abortion matters to you. Because a lot of you today are saying, it's just not my issue. Most Americans today are saying, I would never have one, but I just don't want to be judgmental about someone else. But in the end, to bring this around to the politics of abortion, which I was asked to address this morning, is actually about brute power. Let's hear a little bit more from Mary Beth Williams. She concluded in that infamous Salon article, "I would put the life of the mother over the life of a fetus every single time, even if I still need to acknowledge my conviction that the fetus is indeed a life worth sacrificing. A life worth sacrificing." She's so glib as she says this, but the ramifications of this are so deeply serious for all of us, because this way lies brute oppression. It's ever been thus. The tyrants begin sacrificing lives that they deem unworthy. They choose the lives that are worthy of protection and defense, and which ones are mere fallout. Make no mistake, Roe at 40 is about raw, brute, callous power over the helpless. This question of why should I care is one of the biggest ones that we face today. Planned Parenthood has a new video out saying, "You haven't walked in her shoes. You don't know how she feels." So why does it matter to the community? It matters to the community what her personal decision is, because life does tend to be complicated. Life is complicated, always and ever. It's complicated and messy, but in that messy, complicated chaos, that is where life is truly beautiful. Why does the individual's choice matter to the community at large? It's because the answer centers on this question of power. Tyranny is not a human impulse that is easily tamed, that you can look away from and put it over here in this category that says only in abortion are we going to allow tyranny. Only when it's complicated do we allow people to personally decide whose life is worth sacrificing. Roe at 40 is a question of who we all are and what a civilized community will tolerate. Wanted to talk about SART, but I'm going to move forward and skip that section. because I want to get back to dating. So hang on, for those of you who've drifted away, don't lose me here, because I'm coming into how this really affects you on the day-to-day here on Wheaton's campus. But before I segue into that, I want to ask, how's this female empowerment working out on the ground for women? How's that working out for them? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands if you watch Lena Dunham's HBO show Girls, because I hope you're not. But I do. And it's really, really awful. It's really awful, and it's really surprising to me how celebrated the pain that week after week Lena Dunham puts on the screen, how celebrated that is, and what a warped and twisted viewpoint they have of feminine power. But there's one scene that particularly broke my heart, and it's a scene that I'm sure some of you all have seen on YouTube, because it's all over Tumblr and all over the place. Because, if you want to engage people in art, you eventually have to tell some measure of the truth, right? And Lena Dunham can't get away from the truth. And there's this really poignant scene where she discovers that her boyfriend, Adam, possibly has another girlfriend on the side. And so she goes marching over to his apartment to confront him. And she gets herself really worked up, and she gives this long monologue. And then here's the key point that she says: I just want someone who wants to hang out all the time with me and thinks I'm the best person in the world and wants to have sex with only me. Like, really, Lena? Since when? Because that sounds exactly like marriage to me. Isn't that why we have marriage? For defining these terms of our relationships. Why are you upset if he's cheating? That's what marriage is for. So there's a study that has gotten almost no attention in the popular media, but the data is deeply significant. Recently, a study found that 1/3 of adults aged 45 to 63 are now unmarried. 1/3. This represents more than a 50% increase since 1980. Just since 1980, when only 20% of middle-aged Americans were unmarried. And then here's the kicker. 1 out of 3 of these were never married. Never married. So, ladies and gentlemen today, why should abortion matter to you? Why does somebody else's choice matter to the rest of us? Because it is striking at the heart of community. Increasingly, we're living alone. A woman doesn't go to an abortion clinic because she wants an abortion. She goes to an abortion clinic because she feels alone, because she feels she has no choice. That's what strikes at the heart of human community. Abortion, at the end of the day, leaves us alienated from each other, and it leaves women and men both alone. So let's bring it in to a close, because we're out of time. How do you fight abortion? I want to put a really radical notion on the table. Go on a date. Go on a date. When I sat in your seats, there was another topic of great concern to me. I didn't mean to be too flippant. It wasn't only the boys. It was mostly the boys. But I did have sometimes another thing on my mind, and it's this great and beautiful motto for Christ and his kingdom. I wanted to change the world when I sat in your seat. And as a brief side note, let me tell you seniors that when I sat in your seat, I was terrified because I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And God was faithful in directing my steps. But I wanted to change the world. I wanted to do something for Christ and his kingdom. Do you want to change the world? Do you want to make a difference? I know you do, because I know that's why you came to Wheaton. Then remember that in 21st century America, the personal is political. Go on a date. There is nothing in this country that needs more revolution than the sexual habits and expectations of young people. The hookup culture today is corroding the foundations of intimacy and lasting commitment. You here at Wheaton, you need to lead the way in demonstrating what it means to respect one another. Rebecca Walker thinks abortion is a rebellious and empowering act. I'll tell you, if you want to be rebellious today, confront the hookup culture. Demonstrate that there's another way. Go on a date. Gentlemen, I told you I was not letting you off the hook today. Come on, guys. Today, what's today, Wednesday? It's Wednesday, perfect. It's perfect. Wednesday's date asking day, right? I mean, some traditions are still alive, are they not? Go ask a friend. Go ask a friend to get ice cream with you. This does not have to be someone you're determined to marry, okay? Just a friend. Okay, don't clap, because I'm going to make it harder. You have to ask her in person. You really do. Okay, if you really just cannot, I will give you an absolution to do it by text, but come on, work it up to doing it in person. Okay, but ladies, those of you who are clapping, and I saw you doing it, you are not off the hook. There had better be just a firestorm of people asking people to get ice cream today. And when he does it, because I don't just have 3 daughters, I have 2 sons. I have 2 sons, so I know the other side of this equation all too well. When he asks you, even if you don't want to marry him, say yes. Say yes. It doesn't have to be a big deal. You want to start a real revolution in this country, then fight against the radical individualism that threatens to characterize relationships in 21st century America. Do you want to change the world? Strike a blow by defending life, by remembering that the personal is political. Then go on a date, because that's where it starts. You're dismissed.